Hello, everyone. This is the Vice President of Internet Infidels, Edward Tahmizian. You know me from my published paper on the origin of evil and theistic art determinism. And today, once again, I'm going to be interviewing the legendary and beautiful Dr. Robyn Walsh, who's an associate professor at Miami University. And we're going to dive right into the questions. So, Dr. Robyn Walsh, some say the Gospel of Luke is a reliable source of history because of how well written the Greek is in the first paragraph and how accurate of a history it allegedly records. Richard Carrier states that Luke does not employ the devices we would see in a more critical historian like Suetonius, and how he discusses the conflicting data surrounding the birth of Caligula and talks about source material. In contrast, Luke says nothing about any documents he used, and when there was a conflicting information between one source and another, why he preferred one source material over another. Also, Luke claims eyewitnesses passed down information to some Christians, not that he personally had dialogue with the eyewitnesses themselves. So, what would you say in response to this? What dating would you give the book? And what do you think was the purpose of Luke writing? What was the author's intent?
So I'm not as hung up. Oh, by the way, thanks for having me. I should start with that. And also, you accommodated me because I caught strep, which I didn't know you could get after the age of about 12, but somehow my son gave me strep throat. So thank you for accommodating me and rescheduling, but I'm very happy to be here. So the thing is, I'm not as hung up on does Luke look exactly like Suetonius? And part of that is because I think we have to keep in tension here that Luke is doing something really interesting, which is he does include that preface, which none of the other gospels do, which explains some of his process. And that process looks pretty normal for the Greco-Roman world of the empire. So to kind of take one of the last questions first, I would date Luke to probably second century. I think that that's probably pretty secure. Late first, I think at best, but probably, early second, late first century. And so within that ambit, it makes a lot of sense to me. And he doesn't have to my mind, click every single box of what you would expect from someone like a Suetonius. And that's in part because I think we have to contend with the reality that the Gospels, especially being in Koine, they're not quite that high literature that some of our canon of authors represent. And so I think he does a fair job doing what you would expect from kind of a middle tier literary product for middle tier literary product. And here I'm thinking in part, and I should say I'm Zool today because I'm in my childhood bedroom. I'm visiting grandma and grandpa with my son. So I don't have all my books in front of me, but I'm reminded of Francois Bauvin's Hermeneia commentary on Luke, where he goes through other prophecies that you see from ancient historians, but also medical writers, which is interesting because people often associate Luke with being a doctor, right?
Yeah,
And that,
sure.
and he gives a lot of great examples. And again, I'd pull that out if I were, in my office. But he gives some great examples of medical writers who say basically the same thing Luke does in terms of a process and other sources they've consulted and people they've talked to. And, I've looked at a bunch of different things and I'm going to put together the best version of what I can for you, right? Like more or less. And I would say that those kinds of medical writers maybe are in the same kind of tier that we're talking about here. And so then I start to wonder, I wonder why people in antiquity thought Luke might be a doctor. Well, maybe they're familiar with this kind of preface that you see in medical writers or other kinds of literature that's being produced in this era. And I'm also reminded, just to give more bibliography for your viewers, of a work by David Constan. He's done a lot of work in this area too on thinking about different tiers of literature. But he writes something that he calls the active reader in the second century. He writes about this. So this is an expanding readership, so newly literate people under the empire who are interested not just again in that high tier canon of literature, but something a little bit more middling. So I would say Luke fits that pretty well. And his discussion of eyewitnesses, for example, I mean, everybody did that. I mean, back to Plato, you have ancient authors talking about like, well, it's always better to not stay in your library and be obsessed with your books and like only trust your books. You should go out there, especially if you're writing histories and talk to people and travel and like put in the effort. Like that's basically it. The message you get is like, put in some effort, dude, and like go out and talk to people if you want to confirm what you're doing. Another piece of bibliography I can give you too is Suzanne Marchand just wrote a piece on Herodotus and Thucydides. And even in antiquity, people would be like, Herodotus, I don't know. Like maybe he traveled to some of the places he's talking about, but maybe not. Some of the stuff he's claiming sounds pretty weird, but Thucydides I trust a little bit more, right? So these debates were going around in antiquity too. It's not like a preface protected you. It's not like if you had a particular kind of preface, you're a historian or not. Established historians still kind of had to fight for rank and for attention. And so I think if we understand that a little bit more, what do I want to say? Not liberally, but like with a little more latitude, I guess. Like if we just accept the fact that Luke even has this preface in the first place, he's definitely situating himself, I think, with a variety of other writers without having to necessarily achieve the level of a Suetonius. So in that respect, I think he's telling us something that indicates that he's trying to write a good history. And the fact that he says that he talked to people who talked to people, let's put it that way. Like he didn't speak necessarily to eyewitnesses, but people like in the chain of eyewitness testimony.
Mm.
Again, very, very typical because better to hear it with your own ears or see it with your own eyes than to just trust other accounts. And so Luke is telling us he did both.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, Herodotus definitely wasn't telling the truth when he said that Circe's army was 1,300,000 individuals. That seems highly
Yeah, I mean,
unlikely.
Herodotus says a lot of stuff about, especially far-flung locations, that and some of it like I just can't repeat here because it's like a little too crazy. But it's like one that kind of comes to mind. I think Marchand might have mentioned this, but he talks about like the dog face people. Like there are dog face people that live in these caves in this particular location. And I think even people like Alexander would claim like, oh yeah, I saw the dog face people. Like everybody knew it was a lie, but to prove that you were a proper eyewitness in a certain place, you would always claim like, oh yeah, the dog, I saw the dog people. Like, so there was kind of this conceit that went on that like, almost like a conspiracy that to show like you're with the Joneses, like you had to have seen these things that were claimed or know these things. And so you could make some pretty fantastic claims and they would get double and tripled down in antiquity.
Yeah.
Well, not too
Awesome.
surprising to me.
Awesome. Thanks for those insights. Alrighty, going into our second question. Do you believe the empty tomb account in the four Gospels is recalling some historical truth? William Lane Craig, who I've interviewed before, he states that a member of the Sanhedrin asking Pilate for permission to give the body an honorable burial is unlikely fiction, since the Christians saw the Sanhedrin generally as the enemy. What would you say to this?
So, I would say that I think we have to allow the genre and form of our source material to allow things like the empty tomb to be palatable. In other words, I don't know if Jesus was buried or put in an empty, like if the empty tomb is a historical truth, right? Because, in part, because Paul says he died and was buried. And I know John Dominic Crossan has said, like, oh, well, that's almost that's probably true. And other people have said, like, oh, it's euphemistic, right? Like that historical problem of if you're crucified, you're not going to get a proper burial, generally speaking, right? So there's always that kind of tension. The way I see the empty tomb and it's something that I talked about in my last book for a few pages. And there are other scholars like Miller who have worked on the empty tomb motif. It's very much a literary motif. You find it in Greek novels, you find it in concepts of apotheosis sort of across the empire in this period. And so when I say I think you have to make things palatable for the genre we're in a literary genre, whether we want to classify it as biography or history or whatever. We just talked about how we have to have some more latitude in how we understand those categories, right? And so I think that to talk about an empty tomb was not neutral. This was not a value neutral thing to do in antiquity. If you're going to include an empty tomb in your text, it means something very specific. And so you're trying to communicate to your readership something about, let's call it, for the sake of argument, the Christology of Jesus. Like you're saying something about his status, right? And it's something that he's greater than. He's going to be greater than a human being because not only does he get this burial, but then the tomb is empty, and everyone in antiquity would have understood that means he's now a god or he's deified or he's greater than a human being. So, to me, I think the empty tomb account is maybe recalling some kind of historical truth, maybe not. It's hard to say, especially in the face of Paul, right? So here I feel a little bit of ambiguity, but I do think that the text is pretty clear in what it's trying to communicate in that if you have an empty tomb in the first place, you're saying something about the status of the individual.
Okay, so bonus question. So I know you and Dennis R. MacDonald are in agreement about the New Testament writers employing the craft of mimesis in their work. Where would you deviate from him, if anywhere, from
Well,
Dennis's ideas?
yeah, I think that I like Dennis's work a lot. So it's not a critique of Dennis by any means. For me, I like to keep in tension the possible reality that we have more access to things than people in antiquity maybe did. In other words, to make certain claims about mimesis, you can tie yourself very, very closely to the text, even down to kind of that, almost like we do with gospel comparisons, right? Like each individual word and sentence structure and things like that. What I worry about is that we have access to all these things, but people in antiquity maybe didn't. And so I just like to be careful that I don't look for parallelism too closely and things from, say, Homer to the Gospels, because I don't know that the Gospel writers absolutely had everything. I tend in my own work to gravitate out a little bit, almost like a more of a bird's eye view in the sense that I'll say, like, well, I know the Gospel writers are familiar with Homer, if for nothing else, then when they went to school, and I know they went to school, they would have learned off of Homer, right? Like nobody goes to high school and doesn't eventually have to read Shakespeare or something, right? Like there's at
Okay.
least a passing familiarity with this stuff. And we know from school exercises that Homer was often what you would use to, learn to write your own declamations or something. We even have examples lately, if any of your viewers are the kind of people that have like a Google alert for like ancient news, or like paying attention to things they find in Pompeii. They've been finding things like pottery shards where whoever like fired the kiln wrote like a little quick Homeric verse on it, right? So these are people who are not super literate, but Homer was fairly well known. So I don't find it too surprising when you see literary motifs or themes or approaches in the Gospels that you would also see in Homer or see in the Aeneid, because the Aeneid is copying Homer, right? I don't necessarily go for like the one-to-one comparison in all cases, although I think sometimes that can be really illuminating, and maybe you can even tell what the Gospel authors have been reading, right, by doing that kind of comparison. But I think we're pretty secure in saying that the Gospel writers would have been familiar with Homer. And so when we see some similarities between characterizations or structure, that's how they learned, right? Like that's how they know how to do what they're doing.
Gotcha. Alrighty. Excellent advice. Alrighty. So going into our third question, I guess the fourth question. The trial of Jesus has some historical problems. One of them is the fact that during his trial, the Jewish authorities deemed Jesus' claim to be the Messiah as blasphemy, but during the first century it was not blasphemy to claim to be the Messiah. So why are the authorities acting the way they did?
So I have to say that this is not like a topic where I feel super, super expert on, because I don't pay, I mean, like in graduate school, I probably would have said a lot about, right? Like I would have read a ton of stuff, but I have some distance from like Second Temple Judaism now, in terms of things like, is it blasphemy or is it not? But let's take as a premise of this that that's correct, right? That blasphemy is not something that you could actually be charged for. I think that this would be a reflection then of a couple of things potentially. One is the most obvious, some kind of an anachronism, right? Like at whatever point that this text is being written or for whatever strategic purpose, it's important to give some kind of rationale. And maybe it's an anachronism to say that at the time of Jesus, blasphemy was a charge, right? So that could be something that's being retrospected into the past, to fit a particular familiar narrative in the present. But the other thing I would suspect here, and this to me is kind of a characteristic of the Gospels in general, which is somebody like Matthew has a pretty good, familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures, right, with sacred texts, etc. But it's not necessarily the case that I would classify the gospel authors as masters of understanding Judaism in its time and place, at least the one that they're trying to describe, like Judean Judaism in the Second Temple. I don't necessarily give them that much credit. And sometimes I can't quite tell, and I go back and forth in my own mind, is this because they actually don't know anything? Or they're saying things that like they find interesting, or they feel like they need to signal something to their readers. So the one I think I've referenced in the past, is when, you get these kind of comments like, and the Pharisees washed their hands. And you're like, okay, like thanks. Like, great tip, right? Like things that don't really probably need to be explained if you're in the know. And so it kind of becomes odd, right? So I think that this could be another one of those reflections, again, taking the premise of not necessarily a misunderstanding of Judaism, but maybe a characterization of Judaism that fits the author, the time period, the projected audience of the moment. And so I don't, again, worry as much about like historical, ahistorical. It's about like the feel, right? And so they're giving
Yeah.
you a feel like, in Judaism, this is a problem. And Judaism, this, and that. And half the time you can look at what they're
Yeah.
saying, like,
We'll
what?
have to go to Anne Shern White to get info on that, but
Yeah.
unfortunately he died in 1990. Yeah, I
Well,
remember.
on a Ouija board or, crystal ball.
Really?
Yeah.
I know. Summon them like Saul tried to summon Samuel. Yeah, really. Yeah, I remember back in the day, like Christians were really using Ancient and White's for Roman society and Roman law because they were like, Ancient and White strategically proved that two or more generations was too short of time, or yeah, too short of time for the
Right.
hard historic core to be destroyed in the Gospels, and like Christians were like using that a lot, and Carrier was like, well, we have examples like with the Area 51 narrative that the hard historic core was destroyed, in a matter of 50 years, and then he gives the account of the hagiography of Saint Genevieve, where all these miracles are being ascribed to her, like right after she dies and stuff like that. And yes, so it's interesting. I think the thing with Shurin White that was a problem was he was just going on like the tempo of myth making of other myths. Like he was like, well, with Alexander the Great, it took like 400 years for people to ascribe miracles to him. And like I think maybe he covered the Hadith. He was like, well, with Muhammad, it took like 130 years for there to be this like legend about him that he split the moon in front of all these eyewitnesses. But it's like just because something takes such a long time to for people to talk about doesn't confirm or deny that it's ahistorical. That just means it takes a long time for people to go from oral tradition to writing it down. Like he's because his whole logic was like, well, the Bible's, like the New Testament takes like 20, 30 years, to describe miracles of Jesus, so it's way earlier. Therefore, it's more likely that Jesus did miracles. It doesn't like make any sense. It's like myth can be, the hardest. I can get a papyri and destroy the hardest store core within like 20 minutes. Now, if his argument was like, well, it would take so long for myths to accumulate because, like, how could people get away with the lies and stuff like that? Like, I could understand his point. So maybe he was that was part of his reason too. It's kind of uncertain, like, what his reasoning was. Because I could see him saying, like, well, like, if the empty tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, let's just say Christians were talking about it 2 years after the death of Jesus, well, like, it'd be pretty hard to see it as a myth because it's like undoubtedly if the Sanhedrin were to hear about an empty tomb of Christ and it was at a place where it could be checked, they would have checked the tomb first. You know what I mean? So it's like just going off of tempo, how long it takes for something to be written doesn't really mean anything.
And I'd like to see more sociological underpinning to those kinds of claims too, because like one reason I find like Twitter and TikTok really interesting is because sometimes you can see in real time the way that human beings are sort of hardwired to fabricate and invent and attribute things in ways that can be blatantly ahistorical, but nobody seems to care because consensus and like enjoyment tend to overwhelm things. So, like, this is a little bit of a weird example, but like, do you remember a few months ago? Was it a few months ago? Maybe, but a few weeks ago, when, like Princess Catherine is missing. Like, that's a body double. That's a body double at the farmer's market. Like, there was a whole thing about how like Catherine's really dead and like these are body doubles and like this is what but like these conspiracy theories like build up and then when she like came out she's like hi like totally everyone's like no wait let's zoom in like something's wrong like people were looking for the validation the justification for the conspiracy because there was sort of this groupthink right that came up around this one figure where all this mythology all the started to accumulate and attach and I found that really really interesting because then like in real time these things can be disproven but they don't want to let go, right? And that's kind of the thing that I'm talking about in general when we think about like what kind of flexibility to have with these narratives and like what is specifically historical and how can we tease this apart. Human beings have a way of telling stories. And we enjoy telling those stories to each other and we enjoy expanding on them and, accumulating, even if it's not exactly true, of a species of the truth. And so I think that if you watch the way those things happen or how like a certain kind of phrase or individual can represent the zeitgeist in a way, like the hawk to a girl, like now that's the new thing. But anyway, my point being, like those things can come to characterize they have a lot more meaning behind them that a society sort of builds that infrastructure. And those building blocks to me are more interesting sometimes than trying to figure out the actual historical kernel behind every single one, because instead what you really have is some kind of reflection of uh narratives that work. Let's put it that way. Narratives that work for one way or another for a certain moment in time for people.
Yeah,
But the other thing I'll just say about that is you know, the reason I don't worry about the Bible or the Gospels in general, like hanging on to every word and looking for historical truth in every word is in part because I know human beings mediated it no matter what. And again, I see human beings on TikTok and like Twitter, like I see how these things happen, right? And
yeah,
so I know that once it's mediated through all of us, we're pretty faulty.
yeah.
And so I think we have to accept that there's going to be bias and mistake and historical error, willful or not, in a lot of these things.
Yeah, and like you have to remember, like, well, I know you know, but like, I guess I'd be talking to the audience listening to this. Like, just because something is a genre of history and not a hagiography or myth doesn't mean its claims are true. Because to a historian, especially back in ancient times, like you didn't have recording devices like cameras that could or like audio recorders. It's like when people say like events happen or certain people say speeches, it could just well mean that the author thought probably this is what the person said. It's not like they would have had to have heard the person talk to be reciting words like, oh, maybe they're like, oh, maybe I've seen some letters by this person and I can go off of his speech patterns and his ideology. So, like, I'm going to assume that when he was at this, place and said this oration, this is what was said. But it could just be the author just filling in the gaps, going off of like prior speech patterns. And it's not necessarily that he heard, like, some guy say something. So I guess, like, to tie that into Luke, like, even if it was early, like, pretty early, like in 65 AD, he could just be talking to early Christians. And the early Christians could be like, oh, there's this story that the angel Gabriel appeared in front of Zacharias. He was like, oh, really? How do you know that? It was like, I heard that from my uncle, and Uncle Ishmael's like the most honest person in the world, and he only believes in stories if they have historical truth to them. And Luke could just be like, oh, okay, Uncle Ishmael's an honest person, only goes off of evidence if it's good. Okay, I'll just accept that that an angel appeared in front of Zacharias to announce the birth of John the Baptist. It's not like Luke had to be questioning John the Baptist, or John the Baptist would have been dead then. He's actually questioning eyewitnesses who've seen the angel Gabriel.
No, I totally agree. And it's something I find really interesting. In again, I gave you the references to kind of social media, but even in my own life, when I research something that isn't too far in the past, how difficult it can be to reconstruct things. I mean, I can give you a silly example. I mean, but
Good, good, do it.
I mean,
Good
this is
time.
really obscure. But it was something I wasted like 20 minutes on last night. Which is there's this guy Endicott Peabody who was a mentor of FDR. And he apparently died behind the wheel of his car when he was like 87 driving around my hometown. And I happened to be here. So I was trying to figure out like what road was he on? This is somebody who died in the 1940s, right? And I live in the town. I've lived here, like my whole life. And I'm just trying to figure out like what road was he on when this happened? I can't find it. There's no way to find it. It's not in the news stories. There's nobody in living memory who remembers it anymore. Like there wasn't documented, but you could make up a story, right? And I'm only thinking about this because of the empty tomb, right? Like we're talking about like a death story. So again,
Yeah.
very obscure, but I'm just trying to figure out like how would I figure this out? Who would I talk to? Would somebody who knows somebody know? How many people would I have to talk to? Am I gonna have to like walk around downtown and like stop people on the street? Like how would you this out, right, as a historian. And that's the kind of thing Luke is talking about, right? Like he's trying to figure something out about the same amount of time. He's trying to get down the details. I can read some news reports, talk to some people, read some books. That's what Luke would have done, right? Read some accounts and then talk to some local people or people who knew somebody and tried to reconstruct some historical detail about the death of this guy, right? And so you probably have a better chance in Luke's case because you have more people who care, right? But he still has to go through that same process. And it's those kinds of processes that rely on things like oral tradition, that rely on certain kinds of documentation. And remember, we're in a situation when it comes to Jesus where you don't have that documentation because of where he is and the caste of society he's in, etc., right? So when you really kind of think practically about what would it take on the ground to achieve the things that we want these texts to do for us and we want these authors to have done for us, we have to think about the practicality, I think, of our expectations and then kind of calibrate accordingly. And so that way we again get a sense of sort of the impression the author wanted to give us. And one thing that I think is important to remember with any of these ancient sources is exactly like you say, no tape recorders, right? Like no phones to tape any of this stuff. You could try to make some claims about, the cognition of people who come from a, not text-based society. Can they memorize things more easily, right? Like there's worthy conversations to be had, I think, in those areas as well. But I think generally speaking, most people had a pretty moderate expectation for the truthiness of the things that you would read about. And that is because of exactly that. You can't necessarily confirm certain details, especially further in the past, even a couple of generations. And so sometimes it's better, as Plutarch says, to give an impression, right? To give a sense of what somebody was like, or a sense of the things they said or did, or give an impression of the kind of individual we're talking about, because that impression is what you want to walk away from. You're not necessarily going to hang on to every single detail, right? And so I think as long as we're attentive to, again, we want these texts to do so much for us and answer so many of our questions, but those are things that maybe they were never intended to answer. And when you think
Point.
about, right, like they're not calibrated to our expectations. So I think if we keep that intention, we'd be happier in life.
Yeah.
Do what we can to like come up with certain answers for sure, but to meet these texts where they're at in their moment, which is that, they were trying to give an impression of what someone was like, document some aspect of this history, but they didn't necessarily know that we were like Luke didn't know we were going to scrutinize his nativity to figure out like was Quirinius governor or not. And, like those kinds of things. Like I don't think that they couldn't necessarily confirm them, so we shouldn't hold them to too high a standard.
Or rather, the angel Gabriel really appeared in front of Zacharias or not.
Right. I mean,
All righty.
yeah, these are different questions.
Yep, yep. All righty. We'll do one more question. This will deal with Revelation since this is a good topic, the book of Revelation, and I'm sure even if this isn't your strong suit, you'll be able to answer this question because it's a
That
it's a
actually freaks me out. That's the only reason I don't. It gives me,
Uh,
yeah.
but it's an interesting question because it's brought up a lot. So, like in the beginning, the author of Revelation saying, this is a revelation from Jesus Christ. He sent his angel to tell us about what will soon take place, and then he eventually says, I think, in the author says in Revelation chapter 1 verse 3, I'm talking about events that are going to happen in time shortly. It's like Kyrios Ingos, which is just, the time is near. So what Christians often say is, well, in the beginning, the word tachi or tacos, the tachos or whatever the Koine Greek word for shortly, really just means the second coming in the end times is coming without delay. It doesn't mean shortness and duration, which, I could say, okay, I think tachi could mean that, but when you go into the other part in chapter 1 verse 3, where it says, the Kyrios, the time is near, and then the word for near is ingos. Well, that in the Koine Greek actually means near in duration, and plus it's in relation to Kyrios time. So that has to mean that the time is near. So that in duration, so then the Christians will say, okay, well that latter part has to do with the time is near. All right, but then they'll say, well, the author's just saying that the end will happen near in God's time, but far in our time. And okay, so I'll just let you carry over from this. Like, how would you respond to that?
Well, okay, so a couple of things about the text. It does give me nightmares, at least it did a few times, when I was teaching like intro to New Testament, like the night before would scare me.
Oh my God.
I would always have some kind of dream about like, the angels in the sky and like blah blah blah. So I started to so then I would dress like the Whore of Babylon when I came into lecture, and that kind of like that comedic aspect kind of like tempered it
You
for me a
really
little.
did?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I had a colleague
Jamie.
at the time who would dress as the Beast, and so he would like come in and like we would just turn into like a comedy just to kind of lighten the mood. That seemed to help a little bit.
Interesting.
But it's one of those texts, and I struggle with it because of some of the violence in it, which is not my cup of tea. I mean, why did I go into biblical studies? But anyway, but that one in particular, I struggle with. So with all of that as kind of the prefatory remarks for why, I don't research this one too much. The few things about Revelation that strike me are that it is a genre, the idea of the revelation, and especially within Jewish literature, this idea of detailing what precisely the Son of Man is going to do. And I think that whether it was expected that you would have that kind of narrative within Christianity, I mean, everything leads up to it, right? Like, this is what Paul is promising, this is what Jesus is promising, the ushering in of the new kingdom. Like, this is what, in one facet, the Messiah is supposed to do. So I think that as a capstone to the New Testament, it makes perfect sense. Like you not only have this revelation of Jesus, who's supposed to be the promised Messiah, and then all this information from Paul and the Pseudo-Paulines on, in Acts on, how the movement becomes a religion and how you found, how it's founded and structured, etc. You need to have something at the end of all that to say, and then here's the payoff. And especially if there's some vengeance, like that's usually welcomed to some degree. But sometimes I have wondered with that text, and this is something I first heard Nicola Denzi Lewis say, who's a professor at Claremont. It's quite possible that that text, while you have that kind of prefatory material that identifies Jesus as the Son of Man, that the kind of revelations, I try not to say revelations because it's revelation and people always put an S on it, but it's because you have those different revelations within the text, right?
Yeah.
That those features were very common to the genre, that were not exclusive to Christianity, but were part of this greater narrative of what's going on with the expectations for the Messiah. And, this is something I don't think she's put in print, and something she probably said, like 20 years ago. So, I want to caution that this is a telephone version of what I've heard her say, or at least my interpretation of it. But I found that really interesting and compelling. Not because I want to take some kind of specificity away from Revelation as a Christian document, but because it highlights the degree to which this is a very kind of common narrative. And so that's something that I always kind of keep in mind with that particular text. And now I'm forgetting what your original question was about it.
It's all
But
right, hey. It's going to go off on
it was-
tangents. I love to do them. Yeah, so the question was, so like the Christians like, okay, we'll admit that the author of
oh,
Revelation,
yeah, like
yeah,
when's it going to
the
happen? Sorry.
time, yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, so I think one thing you probably hear is that like, well, it's not human time, right? But that's kind of what I meant when I was saying like as a capstone to the canon that is formed, it makes a lot of sense because it's telling you what that payoff is, because it's been promised the whole way. And if you didn't have some kind of vision of what that was going to be, then what was that all for, right? Like you kind of everything, the way the canon was structured was leading towards that. Tell me specifically what to expect. And so
Yeah.
that's why I see it there. So thank you for reminding me, because that's why I said everything else that I said, which is, the genre existed, this kind of series of visions. These were things that you can imagine were already out there. And then if you append that to a story about Jesus as Son of Man, again, one, feature of what the Messiah could or should look like, I think that it created a nice little tidy box. That really kind of conformed to the expectation that was there in the collection of the canon. And so I don't worry so much about the particular time, because the other thing because of course, like everyone will come up with a reason why, right? So like those are the kind of things that like I don't have time to worry about, because it just there's too many explanations out there. But the other thing I think to keep in mind is just the work that it does within the canon itself, and don't forget that Revelation as a text didn't always make it into some of the earliest canons. Some people didn't like it for various reasons. And so if you look at, a table of what texts make it into certain codices or are featured in different canons along the way over the years, sometimes you have Shepherd of Hermas and Revelation isn't even there. There was some debate about it, but again, it just makes that nice arc of, we start with the genealogy in Matthew right after reading all of the sacred Hebrew texts. And then you have this nice, story of Jesus, story of Paul, Acts, right? Like the story of Paul, even though that they should be switched, right? Because those Paul's earlier, but whatever. So then we have Paul, and then we have community construction, and this is what's going to happen in the end. So I think that's why it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking about your comment of dressing up as the whore of
That was
Babylon.
horrible.
I can just imagine a teacher coming in with like a really short skirt and
I
I,
had no, no, no. I had a long cape, and I made
oh,
a purpose Barbie art. I made a headband
oh, okay.
that
Like,
had like distorted Barbie heads, like like I like made them
dang.
look off and like gave them mohawks and like crazy hair, and so it had like this radiating like sun beam with these like repurposed Barbie heads on it.
Like a royal whore.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey,
Yeah.
classy. There we go. That's cool. And then someone else dressed up like a one of the beasts.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
cool. And
Yeah.
it makes the class more worth it to learn about Revelation.
Memorable. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. Alrighty, well, that's all the questions I have for you. That was a very good interview. Thank you for making time, Robin Faith Walsh. And y'all should check out her work. I believe it's called The Influence of the Greco-Roman Society on the Authors of the New Testament or Culture.
No, the origins of early Christian literature. But people can just go to robinfaithwalsh.com, I think is what it is. But
Sweet.
I put all my stuff there, like the latest stuff, and I have a bunch of new pieces that'll be coming out in the coming months. So keep an eye on that space for some, and academia.edu for some new articles coming out on Mark and influence of the Aeneid and Homer on Mark. I have a piece that should be coming out for Harvard Theological Review soon on what Paul thinks the moon is. And then something coming out with the next quest for the historical Jesus is the piece on Mark. And then there are a few others. I have something on Laodiceans that's coming out in an edited volume on authorial fictions. So just keep an eye on my website and you'll see some other stuff coming down the pipe.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right. Thank you, Dr. Robin Faith Walsh. And in a couple of minutes, I'll give you this interview. You can share it with Finn's family, do whatever you want with it.
Thank you.
All righty. Thank you.